Hi everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Kendall. I'm actually the teen services librarian here, but there was an opportunity to do this program and I jumped at the chance because I think it's a really cool subject that we're going to be talking about. So Hannah Cyrus is going to be speaking some on Boston marriages along with Boudreaux. So I'm just going to let them take over and get started, and I hope everybody enjoys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kendall, and thank you everyone for coming out tonight, braving the power outage and who knows what else. So it's lovely to see such a full room. I had this idea, I've been kicking around this idea for several years about we should do something about Blue Hills Boston marriages. There's all these cool ladies in Blue Hills history that were in couples together, and it's like we never really have had something focused on that that I know of. So I was really happy to be able to work with Anne and put something together for this year in celebration of Pride Month. I'll plug at the end, but there is going to be a Pride celebration next door at the Congregational Church on Saturday, so hope some of you can join us for that as well. But for now, let's talk about these ladies. Blue Hills Boston marriages. We're going to talk about 3 female couples that have all been very impactful in Blue Hills history. I wanted to start off just asking sort of what do we mean by Boston marriage? I bet most of you have probably heard that term before, but in case you haven't, the definition I found, which I liked, is a long-term loving relationship between 2 women. And one of the characteristics of this sort of phrase, the Boston marriage, is that it's sometimes a little ambiguous, right? Is it a romantic relationship? Is it a sexual relationship? Is it just a very close domestic partnership? People can kind of use this term to encompass a lot of different types of relationships between women, and because it was so unspoken so often at the time, a lot of the historical record makes it a little unclear exactly what that relationship might have been. So I'm going to start out talking about 2 women, Lynn Thompson and Dee Haywood, and I will note some of the information in my presentation actually, because that historical record can be so ambiguous around these types of relationship, it comes from a weird personal connection I have to this story, which is that my college roommate, Malachi, who I went to Bowdoin with, but who grew up mostly on the West Coast in Oregon, her family was next door neighbors with Dee Haywood in Boston at the end of Dee's life. Total coincidence that I did not know until after I moved here. So she, and especially her mom, Mara, personally knew Dee. Malachi was a little kid at the time, but Mara has very, strong memories of living next door to Dee and being dear family friends with her towards the end of her life. So some of those blanks from the historical record are able to be filled in through a little bit of oral history. I had a great phone call with Mara, and she told me all about her experiences hanging out with Dee towards the end of Dee's life and what she knew about her relationship with Lynn. So Lynn Thompson and Dee Haywood are the first couple we're profiling tonight. Lynn, her full name is Lillian Hersey Mudge Thompson, and she was born in 1892 and lived till 1983. Dee, her proper name is Dorothy Chester Haywood, 1902 to 1996, and these 2, they did a lot. They were powerhouses. So they were artists, they were entrepreneurs, businesswomen, they were deeply involved in sort of early modernism, and they were big innovators. So you may have heard a little bit of their story if you're familiar with Picasso and Pie, which is a beloved historical event that happened at the Blue Hill Library, in fact. We'll talk a little bit more about that. You may also have heard tell of the Rowan Trees Pavilion, or just the Blue Hill Pavilion. That was a very innovative building that was in the center of Blue Hill for a relatively brief period. And they were also lifelong companions to each other. So they did all of this amazing stuff, in our town and elsewhere, and they really lived their lives as partners. I'll share a little bit about their lives. I think there's an open seat in the front if somebody wants to come sit. Yeah. So Lynn, and just for anyone who wants to continue trying to do some research about her, sometimes her name's spelled without the E, sometimes it's L-I-N. Her first name was actually Lillian, but mostly she styled it Lynn with an E. She was born in Illinois. She did have a Maine connection. Her mom's side of the family was from Bangor, the Herseys. She attended Bryn Mawr College studying English, and I found a great note on some alumni survey that she'd taken later on from someone calling from Bryn Mawr asking why she attended Bryn Mawr, and among her reasons she listed to escape the debutante routine at home. So she was not really interested in that lifestyle, although she did come from a well-to-do family. And eventually, after college, she settled in St. Paul, Minnesota, and married Benjamin C. Thompson in 1916. They were married until 1937 when they divorced. They did have a son, Benjamin C. Thompson Jr., who some of you may know is a very well-known architect. And they also had a daughter named Barbara, who died when she was younger. Dorothy, was born in Worcester, Massachusetts. Her father was Albert S. Haywood, heir to the Haywood Boot and Shoe Company. So she also came from money. She got to travel as a young girl. She and her father went and visited Europe. They went to South America. And Mara told me that Dee's preference that she developed during that time was for Italian Renaissance antiques. It was very common for young girls traveling to bring home keepsakes and antiques and pick things up while they were abroad. And that was Dee's taste. Love this photo of her. So Dee, her family attempted to marry her off a couple of times. Starting in 1925, she was engaged to someone named James Murchie Eaton from Calais, but that marriage never happened. And then a couple years later, in 1927, she did in fact marry William Ham Jr. of Minneapolis, who was a brewing magnate. And this is a very fun side quest if you want to go off and research this. He was later famously kidnapped. This is like a big piece of Minneapolis history. Kidnapped by the Barker Carpus Gang. That was after they'd already split, but it's a crazy event that happened in his life. That couple never had any children, and they divorced after just 3 years of marriage. Again, according to family lore from Mara, Dee and Lynn met in Minnesota. They both were living there, and they fell in love. And Dee divorced her husband in 1930, again, after just a few years of marriage. The official reason, according to the papers, was desertion. Again, what I've heard is that she basically realized she wanted out, she wanted to use whatever excuse would be easiest and cause the least trouble, and she didn't ask them for any money. She just wanted to be allowed to leave. So they divorced. Dee returned home to Massachusetts for a time and then moved to New York with Lynn, who again, Lynn later divorced a few years later in 1937. When the couple was in New York, they were extremely active in the arts scene. They were friends, rubbing elbows with lots of folks whose names you may know. Eugene Ormandy, the conductor, who I've pictured here, Robert Motherwell, Alexander Kerensky, the Russian political figure. They were really in the scene there with a lot of different folks. Lynn was working with the Betty Parsons Gallery. She also wrote radio plays and worked in public relations. Dee was very involved in opera, so they were just extremely well connected in that artistic New York community at the time.
Did she write opera?
I don't know that she wrote opera. What I heard from Mara is that she was like really interested in opera and moved in the opera circles, but I don't know that she actually like wrote a full-length opera. In the 1940s, Lynn was introduced to the Blue Hill area when her son, the architect, was designing a house in Brooklyn. And she and Dee purchased a traditional 1928 French-style manor house, which Lynn's son redesigned in a modernist style. And people were not super pleased about that. So in Head of the Bay, Clow calls this property Bryn y Mawr. But Brad, you said it's called Pink House, right?
Pink House is
How it was known locally, yeah.
Where is it?
Bryn y Mawr was the skill that built the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Where is it is a good question. It's not there anymore, right? Brad, do you remember where it was?
It was torn down about 10 years ago. It was on Sculpin Point.
Sculpin Point. But yes, so this was sort of their first foray into modernist architecture in Blue Hill. And that taste for modern art and architecture continued to spread as they made their homes here. We've got a seat right here if you'd like to come sit down. Yeah, that's okay. So I mentioned Picasso and pie earlier. This is a well-known, beloved piece of Blue Hill lore. Because of all these New York art connections, Thompson and Haywood had access to a lot of art that people around here had not seen before. And they hosted a fundraiser at the library. It had Rothko, Pollock, Motherwell, Klee, including a couple Picassos. And Lynn famously airmailed a blueberry pie to Picasso as a thank you for using his name as part of the exhibit. And yeah, as Brad notes in his wonderful article about this, history did not record what Picasso thought of the pie, but we have to assume he must have enjoyed it. So that was the beginning of their sort of culinary experience. I think the thought was people might not be super ready for this modern art, so we'd better have pie too, because we know that people will like that at least. And yeah, I mean, Lynn, self-professed, had not begun cooking until later in her life, but she really took to it and became well known for many of her dishes. There were, newspaper articles in New York about the hits that she was exporting from Blue Hill. I love this headline: Blue Hill Buffet in Maine sends New York a new cheese dessert. Pineapple flavored fluff is a forerunner of a growing assortment of good things. So she worked those connections and continued to sort of make some fun creations here, sell them locally, but also was selling them down in New York. The Picasso and Pie art show was a big success, and so the couple decided to open a permanent location for their shows. Their storefront was right on Main Street. You can see it's next to the blacksmith shop there that you can see to the right of it. And it was designed by Cooper Milliken, called the Pavilion, or Rowan Trees Pavilion. Dee had bought a big stake in Rowan Trees and was working with Adelaide Pearson to incorporate weaving as well as pottery into that business. We're going to hear a lot more about Adelaide later on, but these people all knew each other and were working together. So yeah, the pavilion sold sort of furnishings that Thompson's son would ship up from New York. They showed art. Later on, Frank Hamabi would become the art director there. And they operated a sort of restaurant buffet. So they had a lot going on there. Some more views of the pavilion here. You can see it was, I don't think I can overemphasize what a different style this was visually for downtown Blue Hill. Again, if you're curious more about the pavilion, I really recommend you read Brad's lovely article that he wrote about it. He goes into a lot more detail about the architectural stylings of it than I will here, but here's some interior shots. Again, just this like very New York, very modern style for little Blue Hill in the 40s. But back to the relationship between these women, while they were living together, operating these businesses together, attending all their social events together, they were always styled publicly as Mrs. Lynn Thompson and Mrs. Dorothy Haywood, right? Dee's married name would have been Ham, but I can't blame her for not wanting to go by that. So you can see, again, same breath as talking about Adelaide. We've got Mrs. Dorothy Haywood and Mrs. Lynn Thompson, our guests at the Blue Hill house while their cottage is being prepared. So, the papers were reporting on them as part of the social scene of Blue Hill, but it was never explicitly stated that they were together. Their names just appear together a lot. And yeah, according to family friend Mara, it was pretty well understood among all of their acquaintances that they were in love, but they never acknowledged their relationship publicly. As Mara put it, everyone knew, but you couldn't talk about it, right? And in Lynn's obituary, Dee is mentioned as her business partner, who she ran the pavilion with, but nothing further than that. She's not included in the surviving family section. As for the pavilion, it was torn down in 1967 after it was sold. It was perhaps too modern for Blue Hill's tastes at that time. And Thompson and Haywood retired to Massachusetts and lived together until Thompson's death in 1983. Dee lived on another 13 years, working for a high-end toy manufacturer, and she spoke often of Lynn until the end of her days. I love this. This is another alumni thing from Bryn Mawr, where they sent this to Lynn asking for the correct address, and you can see that Dee's filled out the bottom part of it and said, things should be sent care of Mrs. D.C. Haywood. Lynn Thompson is now in a nursing home, but her mail comes to me as I see her every other day.